"You sent for a wife," Eliza Harper said, standing in the middle of the Brooks Ranch kitchen, her voice steady as iron. "And what you got was someone who could actually save this place if you'd stop treating me like furniture long enough to notice." Nathaniel Brooks stared at her. Nobody spoke to him like that, not in 3 counties. But the kitchen smelled like rot, the men looked half-starved, and the ledgers didn't lie. If you've ever been judged before you were understood, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow every part to the end, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? Montana Territory, 1886. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. Nathaniel Brooks stood outside the Silver Creek Depot with his arms folded and his jaw set, the way he always stood when something wasn't going exactly as planned, which, in recent months, had become his permanent posture. Around him, the other men waiting for freight deliveries and mail packages gave him wide berth without quite knowing why. It wasn't that Nathaniel was rude. It was something quieter than rudeness and harder to name. He was the kind of man whose presence made other men feel slightly smaller without a single word being exchanged. And he had never once thought to fix that. His foreman, Walter Hayes, stood a few feet back, close enough to be available and far enough to stay out of trouble. Walter had been with the Brooks Ranch for 15 years. He had survived 2 brutal winters, a cattle disease that wiped out ranches on both sides of the valley, and 3 separate occasions when Nathaniel nearly fired him for saying something true at the wrong moment. He knew when to speak and when to simply exist quietly nearby. This was a quietly existing moment. "She's late," Nathaniel said, not turning around. "Stagecoach is often late from Billings," Walter said. "Road conditions. I didn't ask for reasons." Walter said nothing more. The truth was, Nathaniel didn't want to be here at all. The arrangement, the letter exchange, the formal agreement, the whole business of a mail-order bride had felt necessary when he'd made the decision 6 weeks ago. The ranch needed managing. The household had collapsed into a slow disaster he didn't have time to address personally. His last cook had quit in March after one of the ranch hands threw a plate of undercooked beans against the wall and called it an insult to surviving men everywhere. Since then, meals at the Brooks Ranch had become a grim and joyless affair that nobody looked forward to and everybody endured. Nathaniel didn't care about food. He had never cared about food. You ate to work. You worked to own. You owned to matter. That was the entire philosophy. But the men were dragging. He could see it in their shoulders, in the way they moved through afternoon chores, in the thin hollow look around their eyes that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with not being fed properly. A ranch hand who wasn't eating was a ranch hand who was going to make mistakes. Mistakes cost money. Money was the one language Nathaniel had never stopped understanding. So he had written the letters. He had been businesslike about it. The way he was businesslike about everything. He described the ranch, the position, the expectations. He listed what the role required. He made no romantic promises because he had none to make. He said he was a serious man looking for a capable woman who understood practical life. The agency in St. Louis had sent him 3 profiles. He'd chosen the one that read like it had been written by someone who didn't need to impress him. The others had talked about their gentle chairs and their eagerness to please. The third one, Eliza Harper, 26 years old, daughter of a boarding house operator from Knoxville, had written 1 paragraph and ended it with, "I am not afraid of hard work, and I don't expect life to be soft. If those qualities suit what you need, I believe we can come to a reasonable arrangement." Reasonable arrangement. He had liked that. It sounded like something he would say. What he had not fully considered was what she would actually look like, stepping off a stage after 3 days of travel across rough Montana territory. When the coach finally pulled in and the passengers began to climb down, Nathaniel scanned them automatically the way he scanned a new herd, looking for quality markers. There was a traveling merchant, a family with 2 small children, an older man in a minister's collar, And then, last off the coach, a woman in a plain brown cotton dress, carrying a single travel bag over one shoulder and dragging a second, heavier case with both hands because it was too awkward to lift properly. She was not what he'd pictured. He didn't know exactly what he'd pictured. He hadn't let himself picture much, but the woman walking toward him now was ordinary in every visible way. Medium height, brown hair pinned back practically, not fashionably, a face that was calm rather than striking. She moved without hurry and without performance, which was either confidence or exhaustion. He couldn't yet tell which. She spotted him before he'd decided how to arrange his expression. He knew she'd spotted him because she walked directly toward him without hesitation, without looking around for help, without the faint, anxious scanning most people did when they arrived somewhere unfamiliar. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Not a question, Miss Harper, Mrs. Harper," she said quietly. "I was married before he passed 3 years ago." Nathaniel absorbed that. It hadn't been in the profile. "My condolences." "Thank you." She looked at him with an evenness that was slightly disconcerting. "I imagine you expected someone different." The directness of it caught him off guard. He was the one who usually said the uncomfortable thing first. "I didn't have specific expectations," he said, which was only half a lie. She looked at him in a way that said she didn't entirely believe him. But she wasn't going to argue about it on a public street. "That's probably best," she said. "Expectations rarely survive contact with reality anyway." Walter stepped forward to take the heavier case from her. She released it with genuine relief and thanked him directly, using his name even though nobody had introduced them yet. Nathaniel realized she must have simply read it off the side of the case. Walter was already reaching, for there was a luggage tag with the ranch name on it. Small thing, but she'd processed it without being told. He noticed that. He told himself it didn't mean anything. The ride back to the ranch was mostly quiet. Nathaniel sat up front beside Walter on the wagon bench. Eliza sat in the back with her bags. She didn't fill the silence with chatter, which he appreciated. Most people who were nervous filled silence with words. She either wasn't nervous or she had learned long ago that words cost energy and quiet was sometimes the wiser economy. About halfway home she spoke. "How long has the kitchen been in trouble?" Nathaniel turned around on the bench to look at her. "What makes you think the kitchen is in trouble?" "The men we passed at the fence line," she said. "They looked tired in a specific way. Not the kind of tired that comes from working hard. The kind that comes from not being properly fed." Walter made a small sound beside him that Nathaniel chose not to acknowledge. "The cook left in the spring," Nathaniel said. "We've been managing." "Who's been doing the cooking since then?" "Different men take turns." "That explains it," she said, and looked back out at the passing land with the settled air of someone who had just confirmed a diagnosis. Nathaniel turned back around. He could feel Walter carefully not saying anything beside him. By the time they reached the ranch, the afternoon was fading toward early evening. The hands who weren't still out on the range were moving through the yard with the slow, mechanical energy of men who were tired not just in their bodies, but in some harder-to-name place. Eliza noticed everything without staring at anything. He watched her eyes move across the yard, the way a person reads a page left to right. Systematic, taking in information at a pace that was faster than it looked. She didn't say anything when they reached the main house. She thanked Walter again for the bags, asked him where the kitchen was, and went there directly without waiting to be shown around or given a tour. Nathaniel stood in the front hall for a moment, slightly wrong-footed by the fact that she hadn't required anything from him yet. He went to his office. He told himself this was going well. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected, and Eliza Harper had expected bad. She stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds. Not moving, just looking, taking inventory with her eyes before her hands. Her mother had taught her that. A woman who rushes into a problem with her hands before her eyes has already made it worse. The pantry door was hanging crooked. Inside, sacks of flour were stacked directly on the floor, which meant moisture damage at the bottoms. A side of smoked meat hung near the window, which was on the wrong wall, catching too much direct afternoon sun. 3 large pots sat on the stove, with residue crusted to the insides that suggested they hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. The cutting board had a deep gouge running across it that had turned dark with accumulated grease and food particles. She didn't make a sound of disgust. She didn't stand with her hands on her hips in the dramatic way that communicated judgment. She simply moved to the pantry first, because the pantry was where everything else began. She was deep in the middle of reorganizing the dry goods when she heard boots behind her. "You settling in?" The voice was male, careful, and carrying the specific tone of someone who wasn't quite sure if she was supposed to be in there. She turned. A man in his 40s, weathered and solid, with the kind of face that had been outdoors in all kinds of weather for so long it had simply accepted all of it. He was holding a tin cup of coffee that he didn't offer to share, and looking at her with a measuring expression that stopped just short of hostile. "Walter Hayes," she said. "You already know my name, I make a point of it." She turned back to the pantry and kept working. "Is there a reason the flour sacks are on the floor?" A beat. "No particular reason. That's where they were put. I'll need shelving along this wall. Raised, not floor level. Can that be arranged?" Another beat. "Longer this time, I suppose. I'd also like to know who's been making purchasing decisions for the kitchen supplies. That's been going through me. Mostly. And Mr. Brooks when the amounts are large. Then, I'll need to speak with both of you tomorrow morning. Before anyone places another order." She pulled out a sack that was slightly damp at the seam and set it to the side. "This one's going to need to be used immediately, or it'll be a loss. Can you send one of the men to tell me when supper is expected?" Walter stared at her for a moment. "Usually around 6. It's 4:30 now." She looked at the salvageable sack and then at the stove. "Good. That's enough time." Walter stood there another moment. She could feel him recalibrating something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. Then his boots turned, and he walked away without another word. She started working. The first meal she made at Brooks Ranch was nothing remarkable in its ingredients. She had what the kitchen had, which was limited. Dried beans that had been there long enough that they needed extra soaking time. So she set those aside for the following day. A smoked shank that was still good if she worked quickly. Root vegetables from a barrel that were 2 weeks from being usable. Dried herbs hanging from a hook near the back window that someone had put up and then forgotten about entirely. She made a thick stew. She took her time with the onions, which she found at the bottom of a crate under the table. She browned the shank until it gave up its flavor properly. She added the herbs at the right moment. She made cornbread from the flour that was still dry and good, adding a little of the smoky rendered fat she found in a jar beside the stove. It was not a complicated meal. It was simply a meal made with attention, which was something the Brooks Ranch kitchen had not seen in a long time. When she brought the food to the long table in the bunkhouse, the conversation stopped, not because anything dramatic happened, just because the smell reached the men before she did. And it was a smell they can't experience in months. The smell of food that had been cooked by someone who understood why they were cooking it. A man at the far end of the table, young maybe 20, with red-burned cheeks and the slightly stunned expression of someone who was always slightly surprised by things, leaned forward and said, "Is that real cornbread?" "It is," she said. "Like actual," she said. "The actual kind." There was a sound that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite silence. More like the collective exhale of a group of men who had been bracing themselves against something for so long they'd forgotten they were bracing. She served them and stepped back. She didn't stay to be thanked. She went back to the kitchen. Nathaniel arrived at the tail end of supper, the way he often did late, distracted, eating because he had to, rather than because he wanted to. She heard him come in and didn't go out. She was finishing the cleaning. And she had learned a long time ago that a man who wasn't ready to see something clearly couldn't be made ready by her walking toward him. A few minutes later, she heard Walter's voice from the dining room. She did all of this with what was in there? A pause. Nathaniel's voice, careful and flat apparently. Another pause. It's acceptable, Nathaniel said. Eliza set down the pot she was drying and stood still for a moment. Then she went back to cleaning. She would give it time. She had learned that too. The next morning, she was up before anyone else. This was intentional. She had learned in her mother's boarding house that the best intelligence about any place came in the hour before the people in it thought anyone was watching. You could see how things actually functioned, rather than how they were presented when someone with authority might be observing. What she saw in that early morning hour at Brooks Ranch was a system that was working the way a machine works when several of its parts are slightly wrong, still functioning, but at a cost that mounted quietly over time and would eventually become catastrophic without warning. The men were up early and moved efficiently enough. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the gaps. The 10 minutes lost here because a tool wasn't where it should be. The 15 minutes lost there because someone had to search for something that should have been immediately to hand. The half hour every morning that the ranch was running at 3/4 capacity because the men hadn't had enough food to front-load their energy for the day's hardest work. She was making biscuits when Walter came in at 5:40. He stopped when he saw the stove already running and her already at the workboard. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "I slept enough." She didn't look up from the dough. "Sit down. I have questions about the supply orders." He sat. She could hear in the way his chair settled that he was deciding how cooperative to be. "I'm not here to find fault with anyone," she said. "Still working. I'm here because the ranch is losing something and it isn't just food." "What does that mean?" "It means the kitchen is downstream of everything else." She finally looked at him. "Whatever's wrong here, the kitchen shows it first. And what I saw yesterday is a kitchen that's been treated like it doesn't matter." Walter was quiet. "The flour sacks on the floor," she said. "The smoked meat in the wrong position. The stores that were ordered but not tracked, so nobody knew what was running low until it was gone." She turned back to the dough. "Somebody has been ordering supplies. But who's been checking if those supplies arrived?" Walter's silence changed quality slightly. She noted that. "Walk me through the last 3 months of orders," she said. "From memory is fine. We'll find the records later," he told her. She listened without interrupting. The biscuits went into the oven. She asked 2 questions when he finished. Then she was quiet, calculating something in her head. "How many head of cattle did you lose last month?" she asked. Walter blinked. "That's not really kitchen-related." She looked at him steadily. "Maybe not directly, but men who aren't eating properly don't track things carefully. They miss things, small things, then larger things." "How many?" A long pause. "We think." She nodded. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Brooks this morning. He doesn't usually like to be approached before this morning," she said again. Firmly, but without heat. "Please let him know I'll be in the kitchen. He can come when it suits him." Walter looked at her with an expression that she recognized from many years of working around men who underestimated her. It was the expression of a man recalibrating his initial assessment and not quite finished doing it yet. "I'll let him know," he said. Nathaniel came at 7:15, which told her he'd made her wait long enough to establish that he came on his own schedule, but not so long that he was dismissing what she might have to say. She interpreted that as a good sign. She had coffee waiting. He sat down across the work table from her without being invited. She turned from the stove and looked at him directly, which she had noticed he didn't always get from people. "I appreciate you coming," she said. "Walter made it sound like I shouldn't wait." Walter was right. Nathaniel's jaw moved slightly. But he didn't argue about her having directed his foreman. He picked up the coffee and looked at her over the rim. "What is it?" She set a piece of paper on the table between them. She had written the numbers by hand while the biscuits baked. Clean columns, clearly labeled. "The kitchen receives supplies every 2 weeks," she said. Those supplies are ordered based on what Walter estimates is needed. The orders go through a man in Silver Creek, the general merchant. I assume, and are delivered by his driver. That's correct. Who checks the delivery against the order? A beat. The driver brings a receipt. Does anyone at this ranch compare that receipt against what's actually unloaded? Nathaniel looked at her. The driver is a driver, she said. He brings what he's told to bring, and carries a receipt for what he was told to carry. Those two things can be different, and nobody here would necessarily know. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear the yard starting to wake up. Boots on hard ground. The distant sound of a water pump. Nathaniel looked down at the numbers on the paper. You did this morning? I've been up since 4, she said. I cross-referenced what Walter told me the orders were with what I found in the pantry. The difference is consistent, about 15 to 20% less than ordered. But at the prices of a full order. He was still looking at the paper. I don't know yet if the error is at the merchant's end, or the driver's end, or somewhere between, she said. I don't know if it's deliberate or careless, but the pattern is consistent enough that it isn't accident. Nathaniel looked up at her. His face had closed in a particular way that she suspected was how it looked when he was processing something he didn't want to be true. You've been here one day, he said. Yes. And you found this. I found it because I was looking for it, she said. Which is different. He set the coffee cup down. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she let it stretch. She had learned not to fill silence when someone else needed it. Why would you be looking for it? He said finally. You were hired to manage the household. I was hired because the ranch needed something it wasn't getting, she said. I don't know yet exactly what that is, but I know the kitchen is usually the last thing a man like you pays attention to, which means it's the first place the truth hides. The thing that happened in Nathaniel Brooks's expression at that moment was small, almost invisible. If she hadn't been watching him carefully, and she was always watching carefully, she might have missed it. It was not quite surprise. It was not quite respect. It was the particular look of a man who had just realized that whoever he'd thought he was talking to, he was actually talking to someone else entirely. He stood up from the table. Find out what you can, he said. Don't do anything with the information yet. Come to me first, I will, she said. He walked toward the door. Then stopped. The biscuits, he said without turning around. She waited. They were better than acceptable, he said. Then he walked out. Eliza stood still for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove and started on dinner. There was a great deal of work ahead of her, and she had only just begun. The numbers didn't lie. Eliza had learned that early. Young, from watching her mother manage a boarding house on a street where half the merchants assumed a woman alone with a ledger was easy to cheat. Her mother had taught her to read numbers the way other women read faces for what they were hiding, not what they were showing. So when Eliza sat down that second evening at Brooks Ranch with the kitchen receipts spread across the work table, she wasn't looking for confirmation. She already had that. She was looking for the shape of the problem, because a problem with a clear shape could be solved, and a problem without one could only be survived. The shape was becoming clearer by the hour. 3 months of delivery receipts, each one signed by the driver from the Silver Creek merchant, each one listing quantities that did not match what had actually arrived at the ranch. Not by a lot. That was the clever part. Whoever was doing this understood that a dramatic shortage would be noticed immediately. Instead, the gaps were modest. A few pounds short on flour. A slightly smaller quantity of salt pork than ordered. Dried beans 2 or 3 pounds under the stated weight. Small enough that an exhausted cook rotating through the job reluctantly wouldn't bother to measure carefully. Small enough that the discrepancy looked like settling and shifting during transport rather than deliberate theft. But across 3 months, across every delivery, the pattern added up to a number that made Eliza sit very still at the table for a full minute. She wrote it at the bottom of her tally sheet and looked at it. Then she got up, put the receipts back in the order she'd found them, and went to find Walter Hayes. He was in the equipment barn, working on a harness by lamplight. He didn't look up when she came in, but the slight change in his shoulders told her he knew she was there. "I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer," she said. He kept working. "Ask. Did you know?" Walter set the harness down and looked at her. His face was weathered and honest, and she watched it carefully for the half-second before he answered, because that half-second was usually where the real answer lived. "No," he said. "I suspected something was off. The men being slow, the supplies running out faster than they should. But I put it down to bad management on the cooking side." He paused. "I put it down to the revolving door of men who didn't want to be in the kitchen." "Who arranged the account with the Silver Creek merchant?" "Mr. Brooks. 3 years ago. Man named Donnelly runs it. Gerald Donnelly. Been supplying the ranch since before I came on." "Who is the driver that delivers?" "Donnelly's nephew. Young man, Cole they call him." Eliza nodded slowly. "And the receipts after the delivery, where do they go?" "I collect them. File them with the household records." Walter's eyes narrowed. "Which you apparently found." "Which I found," she agreed. "Has anyone ever audited them against the actual inventory?" The way Walter's expression shifted told her the answer before he said it. "No. There was never a reason to think." "There's always a reason to think," she said. Not harshly, just plainly. "That's the first lesson my mother taught me." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to need you to help me pull together the cattle records from the past 3 months. Purchase weights, current weights, feed costs." Walter went very still. "The cattle records. Why?" "Because if the kitchen supplies are being shorted, I want to know if the feed orders are too." She let that land before she continued. "And if the feed orders are short, that explains 11 missing head of cattle in ways that have nothing to do with the men working the range." The silence in that barn stretched out long and heavy. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving through the darkness. Walter reached up and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. A slow, deliberate motion of a man absorbing something he didn't want to absorb. "If you're right, I'm not certain I'm right yet," she said. "I want to be certain before I take it to Mr. Brooks. I won't bring him a suspicion. I'll bring him a fact. He's not going to like it, I know." She turned toward the barn door. "Pull the cattle records, Walter. First thing tomorrow." She paused. "And thank you for being honest with me just now." She heard him exhale behind her. Not quite a sigh. Something more complicated than that. She walked back to the main house through the dark and told herself to sleep, because tomorrow was going to require everything she had. She slept 4 hours. It was enough. By the time the ranch was awake the next morning and the men were moving through their early routines, Eliza had biscuits on the table and eggs from the small coop out back, which she'd discovered that first morning, apparently forgotten by whoever had last been in charge of the kitchen, and a pot of coffee strong enough to be taken seriously. She'd also sent one of the younger hands, a boy named Pete, who seemed to be everywhere at once, and nowhere in particular, to ask Walter to bring the cattle ledger to the kitchen. When Walter arrived, he was carrying the ledger the way a man carries something he's not sure he wants to have in his hands. He set it on the table, accepted a cup of coffee without being asked if he wanted one, and sat down across from her. "Before we start," he said, "I want to say something." "Go ahead." "I've been running this ranch's operations for 15 years, he said. "I'm not a man who misses things. I know. So if there's something in those numbers," he stopped. "I just want you to know it wasn't carelessness." She looked at him directly. "I know that too, Walter. Whoever set this up counted on it being invisible. That's different from being missed." She opened the ledger. "Now show me the feed purchase records." What they found in the next hour turned the morning sideways. The kitchen supply discrepancy was deliberate and consistent. Yes, but the feed order records told a story that was significantly worse. The quantities ordered for cattle feed were accurate. The quantities actually delivered, cross-referenced with what the cattle's current condition and weight loss would have required, were not. Someone had been diverting feed, not all of it. Not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough that over 3 months, the cattle at Brooks Ranch had been running on less nutrition than they needed. Enough to affect their weight. Enough to affect their vitality. Enough to produce the slow, accumulating losses that Nathaniel had been watching for months and attributing to winter stress and difficult grazing conditions. 11 cattle hadn't died from the cold. They died because they'd been weakened first. Walter sat back from the table and said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter and harder at the same time, the way voices get when a man is holding down something very large. "Donnelly," he said. "Or someone working with him," Eliza said. "I don't want to get ahead of what we can prove. If this is what it looks like, Nathaniel's going to." Walter stopped again. "He's going to need to hear it clearly and completely," she said. "Not in pieces, not as a suspicion. The whole picture. He doesn't take bad news well." Eliza looked at Walter calmly. "Who does?" She spent the rest of that morning organizing everything she had into a single clear account. Not a complaint, not an accusation. A document of facts with the numbers laid out so plainly that even someone who didn't want to believe them would have trouble finding the seam where doubt could enter. Her mother had taught her that too. If you want a powerful man to hear something he doesn't want to hear, you take away every reason he has to dismiss it before he even opens his mouth. She asked Pete to let Nathaniel know she'd like 15 minutes of his time before the noon meal. Pete came back and said Mr. Brooks would see her at 11. Nathaniel was in his office when she arrived. He was standing rather than sitting, which she read as a man who had already decided to be impatient. She put the papers on the desk between them without preamble and waited while he looked at them. He looked at them for a long time. She watched him. The way his jaw tightened, the way one hand moved to the edge of the desk and stayed there. The way his breathing changed, not dramatically, but in the particular ways of someone keeping the outside of themselves very controlled, because the inside is doing something else entirely. 3 months, he said finally. "At minimum," she said. "I only have 3 months of receipts to work from. The pattern is consistent enough that it may go back further. The cattle are recoverable, I believe, with proper feeding going forward. The ones you lost aren't. But the rest of the herd can be stabilized." He looked up from the papers. "You've been here 4 days, 3.5, and in 3.5 days you found what 15 years of ranch management didn't." She heard the edge in that and answered it carefully. "Walter didn't have any reason to look," she said. "I did." "What reason?" She held his gaze. "Because I walked into that kitchen and the first thing I saw was a story that didn't add up. When a kitchen is starved for supplies, it's usually because someone is taking them." Nathaniel looked back at the papers. The hand on the edge of the desk pressed harder. "Donnelly's been supplying this ranch since my father's time, I know. My father trusted him. I know that too." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear 2 men crossing the yard, their conversation easy and unintelligible through the wall. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning. Nothing about the moment felt ordinary. "What do you want me to do with this?" he said. The question surprised her slightly. She hadn't expected him to ask her. "I think you need to verify it independently before you act on it," she said. "Have someone in Silver Creek you trust not connected to Donnelly count a delivery and compare it to the receipt. And if the count matches the receipt, then I'm wrong and I'll say so. And if it doesn't," she met his eyes, "then you have a decision to make." The office was very quiet. Nathaniel picked up the papers, looked at them once more, then set them down with a deliberateness that told her he was going to do exactly what she'd suggested, and that it bothered him profoundly to be in a position where he had to. "I'll send a man this afternoon," he said. "Good." She turned to leave. She was almost to the door when he spoke. "Why didn't you come to me sooner? You had part of this the first morning." She turned back around. "Because part of it wasn't enough. You needed all of it, or you'd have had a reason to dismiss it." His expression was unreadable. She'd noticed that was his default, not cold, exactly. but contained. A man who had learned a long time ago to keep the surface of himself still while everything else moved underneath. And you knew that, he said. Flat. Careful. I know how to present information to men who aren't expecting it, she said. I've had a lot of practice. She left before he could respond. The man Nathaniel sent to Silver Creek that afternoon was not one of the regular ranch hands. He was a man named Abe Colton, older, someone Eliza hadn't met yet. Walter told her later that Abe had worked for Nathaniel's father, which meant he was the kind of man Nathaniel trusted completely and without explanation. Abe was back by supper time. He found Nathaniel in the yard and spoke to him for less than 2 minutes. Eliza watched from the kitchen window without meaning to, or at least telling herself that. She couldn't hear what was said. She could read it in Nathaniel's body, though the way he went still in the middle of the yard, very still, the stillness of a man absorbing something he had half hoped not to be told. Abe handed him a piece of paper and walked away. Nathaniel stood alone in the yard for a moment. Then he looked toward the kitchen. Their eyes met through the window. She turned back to the stove. 15 minutes later, he came inside. She was finishing the last of the supper preparation when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment and she gave him the time without rushing it. She had learned that the moments after a man discovered he'd been deceived required a particular kind of patience. Too much silence felt like judgment. Too many words felt like interference. The right thing was usually something in between. Abe counted the delivery himself, Nathaniel said. Drove out to the wagon on the road before it reached the gate. Counted everything before Cole brought it in. He paused. 18% short. Across 5 separate line items. Eliza set down the ladle she was holding. I'm sorry, she said. It was the right thing to say. Not I told you so. Not I knew it. Just I'm sorry, because she was. She was sorry that a man his father had trusted had been taking from him, for God knew how long. She was sorry for the cattle he'd lost. She was sorry for the months of men working at Nibinish at capacity because the kitchen was being quietly starved. Nathaniel came into the kitchen and sat down at the work table without being invited. The way he had that first morning. She registered that he was beginning to treat the kitchen as a place where things could be said plainly. And she considered that a good sign. How long, he said. I can't be certain without seeing more records. But the pattern I found is at least 3 months. It could be a year, it could be longer. If it's a year, I know, she said. Before he could finish. I know what the number looks like at a year. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. A gesture she hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled, still surface she was accustomed to reading. Something closer to a man letting something show for a moment because he was somewhere he didn't think anyone was watching him carefully. She was watching him carefully. Gerald Donnelly has a wife, he said. 3 children. He's been in Silver Creek 20 years, yes, she said. That doesn't change what he did. No, it doesn't, but it complicates what I do about it. She thought about that for a moment. It complicates how you do it, she said carefully. Not whether you do it. He looked up at her. Another of those moments where his expression changed in a way that was small and significant at the same time. Not quite agreement, not quite challenge. Something in between that she was beginning to understand was how Nathaniel Brooks engaged with something he found genuinely worth thinking about. Walter suggested the county sheriff, he said. That's one way. You have another? She was quiet for a moment. I have a question first, she said. What do you want? Not what should be done. What do you actually want out of this? He seemed surprised that she'd asked. What do you mean? I mean, some men want justice. Some men want restitution. Some men want an example made, and some men want the whole thing handled quietly, so people don't start speculating about how it happened in the first place. She looked at him steadily. Those are different paths. Knowing which one matters to you changes the answer. Nathaniel sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the supper bell rang. She heard the boots on the hard ground, starting their movement toward the bunkhouse. I want it stopped, he said finally. and I want it done in a way that doesn't make this ranch look like a place that can be fooled. Then you need to handle it in person, she said. Not through the sheriff, not through a letter. You go to Silver Creek yourself, and you confront Donnelly directly. With the numbers in your hand. You give him one opportunity to respond honestly, and you make clear what the alternative looks like. And if he denies it, he won't, she said. Not with Abe's count and my receipts side by side. He's not a stupid man. He'll know the game is finished. Nathaniel looked at her. You've thought this through. I've had 3.5 days, she said. And I don't sleep much. For the first time since she'd arrived at Brooks Ranch. Nathaniel Brooks almost laughed. It was not a full laugh. It was a sound that started to be one and stopped itself before it got there. Like a man who'd forgotten for a moment that he was the kind of person who didn't laugh at things. But it was enough that she saw it, and when she saw it, something shifted very slightly in how she understood him. He stood up from the table. I'll go to Silver Creek tomorrow morning, he said. Do you want me to put together the full account tonight? Everything organized. Can you have it ready by 6? I'll have it ready by 5. He moved toward the door, then stopped, the same way he'd stopped the first morning, when he said the biscuits were better than acceptable. She waited to see what version of that moment this would be. You should know, he said, still not quite facing her, that I don't generally ask people's opinions on how to handle my business. I know, she said. But you were right this morning. About waiting until you had the full picture. He paused. About how to present it. I've had practice, she said again. He was quiet for a moment. You said that before. Practice with men who weren't expecting it. Yes? Your husband? She hadn't expected the question. She stayed steady. He was a good man, she said, but yes. Even good men sometimes need information given to them in the right order. Nathaniel absorbed that. Nodded once, very slightly. Supper's getting cold, he said. It'll keep, she said. It was made to, he left. Eliza turned back to the stove and stood there for a moment with her hand resting on the handle of the pot that was keeping warm. Outside, she could hear the men in the bunkhouse, their voices carrying the different quality of men who had eaten well for several days in a row and were beginning to remember that this was what evenings were supposed to sound like. She thought about Nathaniel, standing alone in the yard when Abe handed him that piece of paper. She thought about the way his hands had looked flat on the table. She thought about the almost law. Then she picked up the ladle and started serving up the pot for anyone who'd missed the bell. She was going to be up until well after midnight putting together those numbers. She was already looking forward to getting started. Nathaniel left for Silver Creek at first light, before most of the ranch was fully awake. Eliza heard him go. She'd been at the work table since 4:30, finishing the account she'd promised him by 5, and she was still sitting there with cold coffee when she heard the horse leave the yard at a steady, purposeful pace that told her he wasn't second-guessing himself. Whatever he was going to do in Silver Creek, he'd made peace with it, somewhere between supper and dawn. She hoped he'd made the right decision about how to do it. She told herself it wasn't her business once the information left her hands. She didn't quite believe that, but she told herself anyway. Walter came into the kitchen at 5:40, the same time as every morning, and stopped when he saw her still at the table. He looked at the organized papers stacked neatly in the center. Already gone, Nathaniel had taken them, and then at the dark circles under her eyes that she hadn't bothered trying to conceal. He left already, Walter said. An hour ago. Walter poured himself coffee and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen held the particular quiet of a place where something significant had been set in motion, and all that was left was waiting. You think Donnelly will try to deny it? Walter said. No, she said. A man who's been careful for this long knows when careful isn't enough anymore. Then what do you think he'll do? She wrapped both hands around her cup. I think he'll try to make it about something other than what it is. He'll talk about years of service. He'll mention his family. He'll find a way to suggest that Nathaniel bears some responsibility for not noticing sooner. She paused. That's what people do when they can't deny the fact. They attack the framing. Walter looked at her. You've seen this before. My mother ran a boarding house for 19 years, she said. You see everything in a boarding house. Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, breathless from some early errand, and announced that 2 of the fence posts on the north line had come down overnight, probably from the wind, and wanted to know if Walter was needed. Walter stood immediately, the rhythm of ranch work pulling him back before the conversation was finished. At the door he paused. You going to be all right here today? He said. Not in a hovering way. In the way of a man who had started to consider her someone worth asking. I have enough to keep me busy, she said. He nodded and went. She got up and started breakfast. The morning passed the way mornings did at the ranch now, with a shape and a purpose that hadn't existed before she arrived. She'd reorganized the kitchen enough in 4 days that the basic functioning of it no longer required her constant supervision, which freed her to think about the things that needed thinking about. While the men ate and dispersed to the day's work, she went back to the supply records. Not the 3 months she'd already gone through. The older ones, stored in a box at the back of the pantry that she'd found her second morning and set aside, 'cause there had been more pressing things. Now she opened the box. What she found inside changed the number considerably. The same pattern, running back not 3 months but 11. Consistent, careful, and so gradual in its escalation that she could see the precise moment when Donnelly or whoever was managing this had decided the operation was safe enough to expand. In the first 4 months, the shortages were tiny, so small she might have dismissed them as measurement variation if she hadn't already known what she was looking for. Then a slight increase, then another. By the time she'd started at the ranch, the operation was running at full efficiency, skimming nearly 20% off every delivery, and had been doing so for the better part of a year. She sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread in front of her and did the arithmetic twice. Then she sat very still and looked at the number. It was not a small number. She was still sitting there when she heard a horse come into the yard at mid-afternoon. She looked up. Through the window she could see it was Nathaniel. Back earlier than she'd expected. He rode in with the controlled posture he usually carried. But something about the set of his shoulders was different. Not defeated, not relieved. Something in between those things that she didn't have a precise word for yet. She put the kettle on before he came inside. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw the older papers spread across the table. His eyes went to them and then to her. What is that? He said. The older supply records. From the pantry storage. She looked at him steadily. Sit down first. Tell me how Silver Creek went. He sat. She could tell by the way he moved that the morning had cost him something. Donnelly didn't deny it, he said. Not after the first 30 seconds. He tried. You were right about that. He started talking about hard times. About his wife's medical expenses last winter. About how he'd planned to repay it. Had he? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. No plan, no record of any kind. Just words. What did you do? I told him the account was closed. I told him I'd be going to the county sheriff unless he produced a written agreement by end of week to repay the full amount. With interest. Over 2 years. He paused, and I told him that if he made one attempt to discuss this with anyone in Silver Creek before I'd spoken to the sheriff myself, the agreement was void, and I'd pursue it criminally without exception. Eliza was quiet for a moment. That was well handled. It didn't feel well handled, he said flatly. It felt like the worst conversation I've had in a decade. Yes, she said. That's what doing the right thing feels like sometimes. He looked at her. You're very direct. I know, she said. Is that a problem? A beat. No, he said. No, it's not. She set a cup of coffee in front of him and then sat down across the table. She pulled the older records toward her and looked at him. I found something this morning while you were gone. She watched his face as she told him. Watched the moment he understood that the number he'd been calculating in his head, the damage, the loss, what it would take to recover was wrong. Not because she'd made an error, because the actual damage was significantly larger than they'd both believed. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Nathaniel picked up the paper with the total on it. He looked at it for a long moment. She didn't say anything. She'd learned in the past several days that his silences were not empty, they were full of processing. And interrupting them was the same as knocking something out of his hands. "A year," he said. 11 months, based on what's in the box. "There may be earlier records I haven't found." He set the paper down. "This changes the agreement I offered him this morning." "Yes," she said. "It does." He looked at her. "I'll need to go back." "Yes, today. If you can manage it before dark." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. At the door he stopped, and she recognized the pattern, by now the pause. The thing he hadn't said yet. She waited for it. "How did you know to look in that box?" he said. "I didn't know specifically," she said. "But a scheme this consistent doesn't start all at once. It builds, and things that build leave records." She looked at him. "The box was in the pantry. The pantry is my domain." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something more private than that. "I'll be back by nightfall," he said. "I'll keep supper warm," she said. He left at a pace that was faster than the morning's departure, and purposeful, in a different way trot the controlled certainty of a man who'd made peace with what he was going to do. But the focused energy of a man who had just realized the full dimension of a problem and was moving toward it without flinching. She watched him go, and then she turned back to the older records. Because there was more in that box she hadn't finished reviewing. She found the third piece of the picture an hour later, and this one stopped her cold. Mixed in with the supply receipts. Filed between 2 months of records, as though it had been placed there deliberately to be forgotten. Was a land document, not a deed. A memorandum of agreement, the kind of preliminary document that preceded a formal deed transfer. It was dated 8 months ago. It referenced a parcel of land on the southern boundary of Brooks Ranch, 40 acres of good grazing land, that Nathaniel had mentioned briefly in their first conversation, almost in passing, as land he intended to expand onto next season. The memorandum described a private agreement between Gerald Donnelly and a man named R. Calvert, representing a party identified only as the Silver Creek Land Trust, for the purchase and transfer of that 40 acres land that was, by every legal record she knew of, still owned by Nathaniel Brooks. She read the document 3 times. She read it slowly, and she read it carefully, and she read it the way her mother had taught her to read anything important, looking first for what it said, then for what it didn't say, and finally for why it had been put in the place where she'd found it. The question of why it was in the supply records box troubled her most. Documents like this didn't end up in pantry storage boxes by accident. Either someone had hidden it there deliberately, intending to retrieve it later, or, and this possibility settled over her with a particular chill, it had been left there for someone to find. Someone who was supposed to receive it and hadn't, and who was now unlikely to be looking for it in Gerald Donnelly's old file of delivery receipts. She was still working through the implications when Walter came back in at end of a day. Dusty and tired from the fence work. He accepted the coffee she handed him without preamble and drank half of it, standing at the door before he registered the expression on her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him what she'd found. Walter put the coffee cup down very slowly. "R. Calvert," he said. "Reuben Calvert." Something in the way he said it made her look up sharply. "You know him." "I know of him," Walter said. "Reuben Calvert is a land broker out of Helena. Works on the edge of legal, always has. He finds parcels that have title vulnerabilities, boundary disputes, unclear inheritance, irregular survey records, and he acquires them through whatever means are available." He looked at her steadily. "He's been known to manufacture the vulnerabilities when he can't find them naturally." The kitchen was very quiet. "The Southern 40, she said, has a boundary survey from 1871, Walter said. "The surveyor who did it died 2 years ago. His records burned in a fire. There's been talk, not serious talk, Just the kind of rumor that floats around, that some of the original survey markers in that section were moved sometime in the last few years. Eliza put both hands flat on the table. Someone moved the markers. Nobody proved it. But if the markers are wrong, then the boundary is wrong, Walter said. And if the boundary is wrong, there's grounds for a legal dispute about who actually owns what. She looked at the memorandum on the table. And Donnelly has been in a position for 11 months to know exactly when Mr. Brooks was away from the ranch, what supplies were coming and going, what the financial state of the operation was. She looked up at Walter. He wasn't just stealing from the kitchen. He was gathering information. Walter's face had gone through several expressions in the past 2 minutes and was now sitting at something between fury and the particular weariness of a man who has been loyal to something for 15 years and is, only now fully understanding what he was up against. Nathaniel needs to know this tonight, he said. He went back to Silver Creek to renegotiate the agreement with Donnelly, she said, based on the original number, without knowing about the land document. Without knowing about the land document, she confirmed. For a moment they looked at each other across the kitchen table. The weight of it was in the room with them, not panic, but the specific gravity of a situation that had just revealed itself to be significantly larger and more dangerous than anyone had understood that morning. "How far is Silver Creek?" she said. "1.5 hours by horse." "Hard ride." She was already moving toward the door. "Can you send Pete?" "Pete's not the fastest." "Then who?" "Abe," Walter said. "Abe Colton. He was already in Silver Creek once today. He knows the road." "Send him now," she said. "Tell him to find Mr. Brooks before he concludes anything with Donnelly." "Tell him," she stopped. "Tell him Mrs. Brooks says the number is bigger than we thought. And the kitchen found something that changes everything." Walter was already moving. She went back to the table and looked at the land memorandum once more. Her mind was working through it the way her mother had taught her, not from the front, where the obvious meanings lived, but from the back, where the actual intentions were. If Donnelly was working with Calvert on the land, the theft from the kitchen and the feed orders wasn't just personal greed. It was tactical. A ranch operating at diminished capacity, with a demoralized workforce and losses accumulating month over month, was a ranch that looked increasingly vulnerable, a man who was watching his cattle numbers drop and his operating costs rise, and couldn't explain why might become, over time, a man who was willing to sell land he hadn't intended to sell, and 40 acres of good southern grazing land, sold under financial pressure, at below market rates, was exactly the kind of transaction that a man like Reuben Calvert built his operation on. She felt something she recognized as anger. Not the hot, immediate kind. The cold, sustained kind that her mother said was more useful because it didn't cloud the thinking. She picked up a clean piece of paper and started writing. She wrote down everything she understood, in order, with the connections drawn clearly. Not for Nathaniel, she'd tell him herself. For the record. For the kind of documentation that would matter if this went where she suspected it was going to go. It was dark by the time she finished. She heard Nathaniel's horse in the yard at just past 8. She heard, from the different rhythm of the hoofbeats, that he'd ridden hard coming back. She put water on for coffee and waited. He came through the kitchen door with trail dust still on him, and a look on his face that she'd learned in the past several days meant he was running 2 or 3 thoughts simultaneously and keeping the surface of himself very still while he did it. "Abe found me," he said. "I had already concluded the renegotiation." She looked up. "Concluded how?" "I went back to Donnelly with the original number and the original agreement terms." His jaw was tight. "Before I could revise it, Donnelly," he stopped. "Donnelly told me he'd already spoken to someone. A man named Calvert." The name landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. "He told you," she said. "He volunteered it." "I think he was frightened." Nathaniel sat down. For the first time since she'd met him, he sat down at that kitchen table, the way a man sits when something heavy has followed him into the room. "He told me Calvert had approached him a year ago. Told him the scheme with the supplies was Calvert's idea. Told him the information he'd been gathering about the ranch was going directly to Calvert. He looked at her. And then he told me something I wasn't prepared for. She waited. The agreement you found in the supply box, he said. The land memorandum. Yes, it's already been filed, he said. In Helena, 2 months ago, Calvert moved faster than anyone knew. The kitchen was absolutely silent. He filed on land he doesn't own, she said slowly. Land he's claiming he has a valid prior agreement to purchase, based on a boundary survey dispute that his people have apparently been preparing documentation for since last spring. Nathaniel's hands were flat on the table. The same gesture she'd seen 2 days ago, but tonight there was something underneath it that she hadn't seen before. My southern 40 acres has a legal claim filed against it in the territorial court in Helena. I have 30 days to respond with counter-documentation, or the claim advances to a formal hearing. 30 days. She understood immediately what that meant. A territorial court claim, properly filed and properly argued, could move fast or slow, depending on who was pushing it, and who was positioned to benefit from the outcome. A land broker with connections in Helena and a plan he'd been building for a year was not going to let it move slowly. Who's your attorney? She said. I don't have one. She looked at him. Nathaniel. Who handles the ranch's legal matters? I've handled them myself, he said. There's never been a need. There's a need now, she said it firmly, but not harshly. You need someone in Helena who knows territorial land law, who can access the courthouse records, and who can file a counter-response before that 30-day window closes. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the controlled surface, not the almost law, not the quiet recalibration she'd been watching all week. This was something rawer than any of those. A man who had just understood, fully and completely, that the ground under him was less solid than he'd believed, and that he'd been walking on it confidently for months without knowing. I built this ranch, he said. It wasn't defensive. It was almost quiet, like a man saying something to himself that he needed to hear out loud. I know you did, she said. My father started it. I built it into what it is. His voice stayed level, but she could hear what was underneath it. And someone has been taking it apart from the inside for a year while I was looking the other direction. You were looking where you thought the problems were, she said. Cattle, fences, weather, range conditions. Nobody looks at the kitchen until the kitchen makes itself impossible to ignore. He looked at her. You couldn't have known, she said. This was built specifically so you wouldn't know. It doesn't make you feel better, she said. I know, but it's still true. A long silence. The coffee was ready and she poured it without asking and put it in front of him. He didn't pick it up immediately. He sat with both hands on the table and looked at the surface between them. And she gave him the time. All of it. I need to go to Helena, he said finally. Yes, I need to find an attorney tonight or early tomorrow. I can write a summary of everything I've documented, she said. All of it. Clean and organized so an attorney can understand the timeline in 20 minutes instead of 2 hours. He looked up at her. You would do that tonight? I'll start now, she said. Eliza. He said her name for the first time since she'd arrived. Not Mrs. Brooks. Her first name, and it carried in it the specific weight of a man who had just realized he was not, in fact, managing this situation alone. Why? She met his eyes. Because this is my home now too, she said. Whether either of us fully planned for that or not. The thing that moved across his face at that moment was not small and not almost. It was real and visible, and he didn't try to stop it before she saw it. He held her gaze for a moment in the quiet kitchen with the wind outside and the distant sounds of the ranch settling into the night. Then he reached for the coffee. Tell me what you need from me, he said. She picked up her pen. Tell me everything you know about that southern boundary, she said. Every survey, every marker, every conversation you've ever had about where that line sits. Start from the beginning. He started talking. She started writing. The night deepened around them. And in the kitchen that had been the first place she'd seen clearly what was wrong at Brooks Ranch. She and the man she'd come here to marry worked through the dark hours side by side, not as a transaction, not as an arrangement, but as two people who had found themselves, without entirely meaning to, in exactly the same fight. They worked until nearly 2 in the morning. Eliza wrote and Nathaniel talked. And somewhere in the third hour of it, the conversation stopped being a deposition and became something else. He told her things about the southern boundary that she hadn't asked for, how his father had paced it out himself the first year, walking the line with a surveyor's chain and a determination that had nothing to do with legal precision and everything to do with a man claiming ground he intended to pass to his children. How Nathaniel had walked the same line at 16. His father's hand on his shoulder, being told that land was the only thing that didn't lie to you. How he had believed that, completely, until this week. She wrote everything down and said very little. What she understood, in the quiet of that kitchen, was that Nathaniel Brooks was not accustomed to talking about the things that mattered to him. He managed them. He protected them. He built walls around them and called the walls responsibility. But something about the specific combination of exhaustion and crisis and 2 in the morning had loosened something in him that his usual architecture kept firmly in place. She didn't push it. She didn't reflect it back to him in the careful way that sometimes felt like manipulation dressed as empathy. She just wrote and listened and let him be the kind of man who was allowed to say true things without having to manage how they sounded. When he finally ran out of information, he sat back in the chair and looked at the stack of pages she'd produced. "That's everything," he said. "That's enough," she said. "An attorney who knows what he's doing can work with this." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm leaving for Helena at first light. I don't know how long it will take. Days, at minimum, possibly a week, depending on how quickly I can get an attorney to file the counter-response. The ranch will be here when you get back," she said. He looked at her. "You'll manage." It wasn't entirely a question. Not quite entirely a statement either. It was something in between the particular verbal posture of a man who was asking for reassurance, while maintaining just enough cover that he hadn't technically asked. "Yes," she said, "I'll manage." He nodded once. He stood. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door, and at the door he stopped the third time she'd seen that pause. That particular hesitation of a man with something left unsaid. "You've been here 1 week. He said, almost. "I've told you more tonight than I've told Walter in 15 years. She looked at him steadily. "Is that a problem?" He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "It surprised me, is all. Things that matter have a way of finding the surface eventually," she said. "You can manage how they come out, but you can't manage whether they do." He stood in the doorway for another beat. "Get some sleep, Eliza." "You too," she said. He left. She sat at the table for a few minutes after he was gone, her hand resting on the stack of papers, listening to the ranch settle around her in the dark. Then she put out the lamp and went to bed. She was asleep before her thoughts could fully form into worry, which was exactly what she'd trained herself to do. Over 3 years of widowhood, defer the anxiety until daylight, when there was something useful to be done with it. In the morning, Nathaniel was gone. The day that followed his departure had a different weight to it. Not heavier, exactly, just differently distributed. Walter took on more than his usual share without being asked, and did it with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the ranch's dignity required no visible scrambling. The men worked their regular routines. Pete fetched and carried with his usual boundless, slightly disorganized energy. And Eliza ran the kitchen with the particular focused calm of a woman who had learned long ago that keeping people fed was its own form of holding things together. But the afternoon brought the first sign that the trouble wasn't going to wait politely for Nathaniel to return. She was at the kitchen work table, reviewing the reorganized supply inventory, building the new ordering system that would make the next delivery impossible to short without immediate detection when she heard horses in the yard. More than one. She counted the hoofbeats without going to look and arrived at 3. She heard Pete's voice, and then a voice she didn't recognize. And then Walter's, which had shifted to the particular register it carried when he was being careful. She kept working. If she was needed, someone would come. 2 minutes later, Walter appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expression was contained, but she'd learned enough about his face in the past week to read what was underneath the containment. "There's a man in the yard," he said. "Name of Hargrove. Says he represents the Silver Creek Land Trust." She set down her pencil. "Reuben Calvert's organization. Yes, he's asking to speak with Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks is in Helena, I told him that. He says he'll wait." She looked at Walter steadily. For how long he didn't specify. Walter's jaw moved. "He has 2 men with him." There a pause. "Making themselves comfortable." She understood what that meant. Men who made themselves comfortable on someone else's property, without invitation, were men who had been sent to communicate something beyond whatever their stated business was. The message was in the posture. "You are being watched. Your absence has been noted. Don't offer them anything," she said. "Not coffee, not water, not shelter. Courtesy without hospitality." Walter blinked. "That's a fine line." "Yes." She stood up. "I'll come out, Eliza. I'll come out," she said again. "I'm the one running this household while Mr. Brooks is away. That's not a position I'm going to pretend I don't hold." Walter looked at her for a moment, with the expression he'd been slowly refining over the past week, the one that had started as skepticism and was working its way towards something that resembled, without quite reaching, admiration. Then he stepped back and let her pass. The man in the yard was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a way that communicated money spent on appearing authoritative rather than money earned through work. He had the smooth, practiced manner of someone who spent his professional life talking people into things they didn't fully understand. And he arranged his expression when he saw her coming into one of polite condescension. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, as though he'd expected her and found her slightly less significant than anticipated. "I was hoping to speak with your husband. He's away on business," she said. "I'm managing the ranch in his absence. What can I do for you?" "Mr. Hargrove." He smiled the way men smiled when they'd decided the obstacle in front of them was minor. "This is really a matter for Mr. Brooks directly. I'll be happy to wait until he returns. I'm not sure how long that will be," she said. "If you have business with this ranch, I'm the appropriate person to hear it." Hargrove's smile stayed in place, but his eyes changed slightly. He'd expected the deferral. He hadn't expected the pushback. "It concerns a property matter," he said. "A boundary question on the southern range." "I'm aware of the claim your organization has filed in Helena," she said. "Mr. Brooks has engaged legal counsel to respond. All further communication regarding that matter should be directed to his attorney." The smile flickered. "I'm not sure you understand the nature." "I understand it, precisely," she said. "A memorandum of agreement was filed in Helena 2 months ago, referencing a boundary survey dispute on 40 acres of Brooks land. The filing is being contested. Legal counsel has been retained. Any discussion of the substance of that claim needs to happen through the appropriate legal channels." She held his gaze without effort. "Is there anything else?" Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Behind him she could feel his 2 companions recalibrating the way people did when a situation had not developed as briefed. "Mr. Calvert would like to resolve this amicably," Hargrove said. His voice had lost its early smoothness. "There's a straightforward arrangement available that would be fair to all parties, Mr. Calvert can communicate that offer to Mr. Brooks's attorney," she said. "That's what attorneys are for, Mrs. Brooks." The condescension was entirely gone now, replaced by something that wanted to be pressure but couldn't quite find its footing against her complete absence of agitation. "A legal proceeding is expensive and uncertain. There are options here that good day." "Mr. Hargrove," she said. He stood there for another moment. She waited. She'd learned that stillness was its own kind of force, that a woman who didn't move when she was expected to move communicated something that words couldn't carry. He left. His 2 men followed without looking back. Walter appeared at her shoulder as the horses moved down the road. "That was something," he said. "Write down the date and time," she said. And what he said, as accurately as you can remember it. "We'll send it to Nathaniel in Helena tonight. You think they'll come back?" She watched the road until the horses were out of sight. "I think Mr. Calvert sent someone to test what was here while Nathaniel was away," she said. "Now he knows." "What does he know?" She turned back toward the house. "That whatever he thought was here, it's not," she said. "Get Pete to write the letter. Your handwriting is slower than we need right now." Walter almost smiled. She was already back inside. The letter to Helena went out that evening with Abe Colton, who apparently regarded hard riding as something closer to pleasure than inconvenience, and set out with the air of a man who had been given a purpose and intended to honor it. Eliza wrote a second document that night, a detailed account of Hargrove's visit, the specific language he'd used, and her read on what it suggested about Calvert's strategy. Not for legal purposes, for Nathaniel, so that he had the full picture when he spoke to his attorney. She was learning that the full picture was always the thing. Half a picture was worse than none. It gave you enough to act on, and not enough to act correctly. 3 days passed. They were not uneventful days. On the second morning, she discovered that someone had threw the kitchen storage overnight. Not a violent disruption, nothing thrown, nothing visibly stolen. But the supply records she'd been keeping, the new ones she'd started from the day she arrived, were not in the order she'd left them. One had gone through them. Hay left one and tried to return them to something approximating their original arrangement. The approximation was close, but not close enough. She knew exactly how she'd left things. She always knew exactly how she'd left things. She told Walter, who turned a particular shade of controlled fury and immediately began asking the men where they'd been the previous night. She stopped him. "Don't," she said. "Someone went through your records, I know. And whoever it was reported back to Calvert that I have documentation going back 11 months. Organized and accessible." She looked at him steadily. "Let them report that. Let Calvert know exactly what we have. It's better for him to know it now than to discover it in a courtroom." Walter stared at her. "You're not bothered." "I'm bothered," she said. "But being bothered doesn't change the right decision." She picked up the records and straightened them herself. "Double the night watch. Don't make a public announcement about it. Just do it." Walter nodded and went. On the third day, a different kind of problem arrived in the form of 2 women from Silver Creek who appeared at the ranch house in the middle of the afternoon with the particular bright-eyed, deliberate casualness of people conducting reconnaissance dressed as a social call. They were wives of prominent men in town. She gathered that within the first 2 minutes, and they had come, ostensibly, to welcome her to the community. What they were actually doing was looking. She recognized the type. Her mother's boarding house had been full of them over the years, women who wielded information the way men wielded contracts, and who were very, very good at creating the impression of friendship while they gathered what they'd come for. She served them tea. She was warm and unguarded in all the ways that didn't matter, and very guarded in all the ways that did. She told them how she was settling in. She expressed genuine pleasure at the land and the work. She said nothing about Helena, nothing about Donnelly, nothing about Calvert. She asked them about the town and listened with real attention, because the information they carried, even the information they didn't mean to share, was worth having. What she learned in 40 minutes of careful conversation was significant. Reuben Calvert had been in Silver Creek 3 weeks ago, staying at the hotel. He'd had dinner with 2 men she didn't know, and a third man whose name she recognized from the county records. Walter had pulled together a member of the Territorial Land Commission who had, if the records were accurate, participated in at least 2 of the commission hearings, where Calvert's previous acquisitions had been validated. She stored that information quietly and said nothing. After the women left, she wrote it all down and added it to the file she was building for Helena. She sent it with Pete that afternoon, because Abe hadn't returned yet and the letter couldn't wait. That evening, she was alone in the kitchen. For the first time in several days, Walter had taken the men to check the southern fence line, which needed attention before weather moved in, and in the quiet, she allowed herself to think about the things she'd been managing around the edges of since the night she and Nathaniel had worked until 2 in the morning. She was not a woman given to self-deception. She had survived widowhood at 23 and 3 years of running her own finances and her own life, in a world that preferred women to need managing. She had come to Montana with clear eyes and realistic expectations. An arrangement, a practical partnership, a life that was workable. What she had not accounted for was the particular quality of Nathaniel Brooks's silences. The way he said her name that night, the way he'd looked at her when she said, "This is my home now too." Like a man who had been given something he hadn't known to ask for. She was not a woman who confused gratitude with feeling. She'd seen that mistake made and paid attention to the making of it. But she was also not a woman who lied to herself about what she noticed. And what she noticed, in the accounting she did in that quiet kitchen, was that in 1 week she had come to understand Nathaniel Brooks better than she had understood her first husband in 3 years of marriage. Not because Nathaniel was easy to understand, he was not, in almost every conventional sense, but because the parts of him that were hard to reach in ways that were honest. The walls were real walls, not performances. The silences were full silences, not empty ones. And when something broke through them, what came out was unguarded in a way that made her trust it. She was thinking about that when she heard a horse in the yard. Too fast for regular business. She was on her feet before the sound fully registered. Abe Colton came through the door, still dusty from the Helena Road, breathing hard, holding a sealed letter in one hand, and the expression of a man who had ridden without stopping because the message wouldn't wait. She took the letter. She opened it. Nathaniel's handwriting, she recognized it from the ranch documents she'd reviewed, was steady but moved faster than his usual precision. The way handwriting does when the writer is thinking faster than their hand wants to go, though. He had found an attorney. A good one, a man named Prescott, who had argued territorial land cases for 20 years and had faced Calvert's organization twice before, successfully both times. Prescott had reviewed the documents and confirmed what she'd suspected. The boundary survey records Calvert's people had filed contained inconsistencies that were inconsistent with natural survey error and consistent with deliberate manipulation. More importantly, Prescott had a contact in the Territorial Land Office who had quietly confirmed that the original surveyor's records, the ones supposedly destroyed in a fire 2 years ago, were not entirely destroyed. There were partial records in a secondary archive that Calvert's people either didn't know about or had assumed were insufficient to matter. They mattered. Prescott had filed for emergency preservation of those records the same day. She read the letter through twice. Then she looked at Abe. "He's coming back," she said. It was in the last line. "Back within 2 days. Prescott needs additional documents from the ranch records, and I need to be there when they're gathered." "Yes, ma'am," Abe said. "He sent me ahead to let you know." She folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she put it in the file with everything else. "Go eat something," she said to Abe. "There's stew on. And thank you, you've ridden that road 3 times in a week." "4," Abe said, with the slight adjustment of a man who kept accurate counts. "Don't mind it." She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the file she'd built over the past week: receipts, records, the land memorandum, Hargrove's visit, the names from Silver Creek, the timeline she'd constructed of how the operation had been built and when. It was a complete picture, organized and clear and fully sourced. She thought about what Prescott had said, that the original survey records weren't entirely gone, that the fire hadn't taken everything, that someone had built an operation on an assumption that turned out to be wrong, the assumption that all the evidence of the truth had been destroyed. Evidence had a way of surviving. Her mother had told her that. The truth is stubborn, Eliza. It finds the cracks, and it stays in them. And when someone finally comes looking, it's still there. She thought about a woman who had arrived at a ranch with 2 suitcases and a cast iron pan, in a plain brown dress, carrying a set of skills that the man waiting for her had not thought to value. She thought about 11 months of careful theft and what had finally exposed it. A kitchen, she thought. Everything came through the kitchen eventually. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, carrying the smell of weather coming. She got up and checked the stew and thought about Nathaniel 2 days from now riding back into the yard, and about Prescott and Helena filing documents that Calvert hadn't anticipated, and about a partial archive that had survived a fire and was now, apparently, the thing that was going to change everything. Walter came back with the men an hour later. She fed them all without fanfare, the way she had every evening since she arrived. The table was loud and warm, and the conversation moved the way it did now easily, without the gray exhaustion that had marked those first days. When the men cleared out, and Walter was the last one at the table, he looked at her with the direct, honest expression that she'd come to trust more than almost any other she'd encountered at the ranch. "Good news from Helena," he said. "Very good," she said. "He's coming back in 2 days. And I think Calvert is going to find out that his foundation was not as solid as he believed." Walter leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "when you showed up here plain dress, 2 bags, that look on your face like you were already figuring something out. I know what you thought," she said. "I thought you'd last 6 weeks," he said. "Maybe 8, if the winters were kind." He looked at her with something that had moved well past recalibration by now and settled into something she recognized as straightforward respect. "I want you to know I was wrong about that, I know," she said. "You've been telling me in smaller ways for a week." He almost laughed. "Is that right?" "That's right." He stood, collected his hat, and moved toward the door. Stopped. She waited, because it seemed to be the thing men at Brooks Ranch did in doorways when they had something left to say. "Nathaniel's going to be a different man when he comes back," Walter said. "I've known him a long time. I can see what's shifting." He looked at her directly. "Don't let him make it complicated. He will if you let him." She held his gaze. "I know how to handle complicated men, Walter." "I know you do," he said. "That's why I'm telling you you don't have to." He left. She stood at the table for a long moment after the door closed. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work because there were 2 days left before Nathaniel returned, and she intended to have every single piece of this picture in perfect order when he walked through that door. She owed him that. She owed herself that. And she owed it to the kitchen that had started all of it. The kitchen that nobody had thought mattered. In a ranch that was falling apart at the seams, where a woman in a plain brown dress had walked in with a cast iron pan and a set of skills that nobody had thought to ask about. The kitchen had been the first place the truth was visible. It was going to be the place where everything was put right. Nathaniel rode back into the yard on the afternoon of the second day. Exactly when he'd said he would. Eliza heard the horse and didn't go to the window. She finished what she was doing, first transferring the last of the organized records into the clean file she'd prepared for Prescott, and then she set the pen down and went to the door. Not running, not performing composure either, just moving at the pace of a woman who had learned that the quality of her stillness told people more about her than most of what she said. He looked different, not dramatically different, not transformed in the way stories sometimes promised, but the specific kind of tired that was on him when he left the grinding. Accumulating exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something too long without anyone to help him carry it, that was gone. What was in its place was something leaner and more purposeful. A man who had been moving towards something instead of managing against it. He saw her in the doorway, and something crossed his face quickly. The way things cross faces when a person realizes they're relieved to see someone and hasn't fully prepared for the size of the relief. "The records are ready," she said when he reached the porch. "Everything Prescott asked for, organized the way you described." "Good." He stopped just below the porch step and looked at her. "Hargrove came." Yes, I sent you the account of it. I got it. A pause. You handled it correctly. I know, she said. Come inside. I'll put coffee on, and you can tell me what happened in Helena. He came inside. He told her while she worked around the kitchen, not sitting still, because sitting still felt wrong for the pace of what he was describing. Prescott had moved faster than even Nathaniel had expected. The partial archive in Helena had yielded the original surveyor's field notes from 1871. Handwritten and incomplete, but containing enough baseline measurements that a competent surveyor, which Prescott had immediately retained, could reconstruct the original boundary line with reasonable certainty. The reconstructed line matched the Brooks Ranch deed. It did not match the boundary described in Calvert's filing. How different are they? She asked. 43 feet at the widest point, Nathaniel said. The markers were moved. Prescott's surveyor confirmed it. The original anchor posts are still in the ground, just below current surface level. Someone drove new stakes inside the old positions and let the old ones sink. His voice was controlled, but underneath it, she could hear what it cost him to say the next part. It was done carefully. Someone who knew land survey technique. This wasn't improvised. How long ago? Prescott thinks between 18 months and 2 years. She set the coffee down and looked at him. Before Donnelly even approached the kitchen supplies. Yes, she understood the weight of that immediately. This was always about the land, she said. The supply theft, the feed orders, all of it was supporting information. Making the ranch look financially stressed. Making you look like a man who was losing his grip. So that when Calvert made a move on the boundary, the context would favor him. Prescott said the same thing. Nathaniel's jaw was tight. He said he'd seen Calvert work this way before. Create the conditions of vulnerability. Then step in when the target is most likely to settle rather than fight. But you didn't settle. I didn't know there was anything to settle. She held his gaze. That's because you found out before he was ready for you to find out. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Because of you, he said. She shook her head slightly. Because of the kitchen, she said. The kitchen was always where the truth was going to surface. I just happened to be the person who walked into it. Nathaniel looked at her with the expression she'd been watching develop over 10 days, the one that had started as recalibration and moved through something like surprise and was now residing in a place she didn't have a precise name for yet. Except that it involved him looking at her like she was something real rather than something arranged. Prescott files the counter evidence tomorrow, he said. The boundary documentation, the survey reconstruction. And, he paused, he wants to include your supply records. The full 11 months. She blinked. Mine, he says, the systematic nature of the theft conducted over that period corroborates the argument that this was a coordinated operation rather than an opportunistic claim. Your documentation connects Donnelly's activities to the timeline of the boundary tampering. He looked at her steadily. He said, whoever put together those records did so with the precision of someone who understood exactly what they were building. She was quiet for a moment. She had not thought about her kitchen records becoming evidence in a territorial court proceeding. She had built them to understand a problem. She hadn't known they were building a case. He can have everything, she said. I told him you'd say that. She looked up. You told him about me? I told him my wife had found the original evidence that cracked this open. He said it simply. Without decoration. He'd like to meet you when this is resolved. She turned back to the work table before her face could do something she hadn't decided to let it do. One thing at a time, she said. Yes, he said. No, one thing at a time. The next morning, Walter took Prescott's documents to Helena with Abe, who regarded his 4th trip on that road with the same equanimity he'd brought to the previous 3. Nathaniel spent the morning on the ranch, the first full morning he'd spent there in nearly a week, and she watched, without appearing to watch, the way he moved through it. How he stopped at the equipment barn and talked with 2 of the men longer than efficiency required. How he walked the yard with his hands in his pockets instead of folded across his chest. How he came to the kitchen at mid-morning without a specific reason, and stood at the door for a moment before coming in. "Is there coffee?" he said. "There's always coffee," she said. He sat at the table. She poured. Neither of them spoke for a moment. And the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that had been earned rather than arrived at. "The men are different," he said. "Yes, since you came." She looked at him. "People work differently when they're fed properly. That's not sentiment, it's straightforward biology. It's more than that," he said. Pete was going to quit in February, he told Walter in March. Now he's talking about asking for a permanent position. She hadn't known that. Pete's a good worker. He is. Hill's also 22 and had decided this place wasn't worth the misery. Nathaniel wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "The misery is gone." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Then, it was here when I arrived. It just didn't have to stay." He looked at her across the table. "You make it sound simple. Most things that look complicated are just things that haven't been attended to," she said. "Neglect creates complexity. Attention usually simplifies." He was quiet. Then he said, "My mother used to say something like that. She didn't push it. She let it be what it was, a man opening a door slightly. Not all the way, and her respecting the distance. Tell me about her," she said. Simply and without demand. An invitation, not a question. And he did. Not for long, 10 minutes maybe. The story of a woman who had built a household in Montana Territory out of what she'd brought in her own 2 hands. Who had cooked for 20 men on a wood stove that kept going out and kept it running through 2 winters before the main house was finished. A woman who had told Nathaniel, at an age when he was still small enough to sit on the kitchen work table without his feet touching the floor, that the kitchen was where you knew a home was real. He'd forgotten that. He said so. Not with sentimentality, just the plain acknowledgement of a man locating something he'd misplaced. She listened and said very little, and when he was done, he looked slightly surprised at himself. The way he always did when something had come out that he hadn't fully planned. "Sorry," he said. "That wasn't." "Don't apologize," she said. "I asked her." "You do that," he said. "Ask things and then actually want the answer. Most people do. Most people ask to be polite." He shook his head slightly. "You ask because you want to know." "Yes," she said. "I do." The quiet between them was different now. Denser, in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. She was aware of it and suspected he was too. And she thought the honest thing was to let it be what it was without trying to name it prematurely or manage it away. She got up and started on the midday meal. He stayed at the table while she worked. He didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask him to. She had learned the difference between the kind of man who needed to be useful in that specific moment and the kind who needed to be present. And Nathaniel was the second kind. His being in the kitchen was its own contribution. Though she suspected he didn't know that yet. 4 days passed before Prescott's word came back from Helena. They were tense days, though the ranch itself ran well. Eliza had the supply system fully operational now, new ordering protocols. Delivery verification procedures that Walter ran with quiet precision. A kitchen inventory tracked closely enough that any variance would surface 24 hours. The men were in a rhythm. The cattle, fed properly for 3 weeks now, were visibly improving. Walter reported it with a satisfaction that he tried to make sound like routine observation and didn't quite manage. On the 3rd day, 2 things happened. The first was that a letter arrived from Gerald Donnelly. Not through Prescott, not through any legal channel, a personal letter. Addressed to Nathaniel, delivered by the Silver Creek postal rider. Nathaniel read it at the kitchen table while she was working and said nothing for several minutes after he finished. Then he folded it and set it down. "He's asking for mercy," Nathaniel said. "What kind?" "He wants the repayment agreement honored. He doesn't want criminal charges." A pause. "He says he has information about Calvert that he hasn't provided to anyone yet. Information he'd share in exchange for the agreement standing." She kept working. "What kind of information?" "He doesn't say specifically. Only that it concerns other properties and other operations in the territory." She thought about that while she moved. Prescott should know about this letter today. I know. What Donnelly has on Calvert may be more valuable than the charges against Donnelly. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. It bothers me that a man who stole from you for a year gets a reduced consequence? Yes, she looked at him. It should bother you, she said. It would bother anyone with a conscience. But being bothered doesn't change the arithmetic. She set down what she was holding and faced him directly. Donnelly is one man who made a serious mistake over a long period of time. Calvert is a system. If Donnelly's information helps stop the system from operating on the next ranch and the one after that, the arithmetic favors uncomfortable mercy. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Is that what your mother would say? My mother would say exactly that. Word for word, she said. She was a practical woman. So are you? Yes, she said. I am. He sent the letter to Prescott that afternoon. The second thing that happened on the third day was smaller and hit harder. She was alone in the kitchen after supper. Nathaniel had gone to check on the south fence with Walter. The men were in the bunkhouse, and she was doing the final tidying of the evening when she found, at the back of the shelf where she'd stored her own things the first day, the cast iron pan she'd carried from Knoxville. She stood there, holding it for a moment. It was her mother's pan, technically passed down at the end of a worn hand, with the quiet instruction that it was only as good as whoever was using it. She had carried it from Knoxville to St. Louis to Montana, through a marriage and a widowhood and an arrangement that she had told herself, very carefully and very firmly, was practical. She thought about what practical had turned out to mean. She thought about 2 a.m. and Nathaniel's hands flat on the table. She thought about him saying her name for the first time. She thought about Walter saying, "Don't let him make it complicated. You don't have to." She thought about a kitchen that had been neglected and frightened and half-starved, and what it had looked like after 3 weeks of being attended to. She was still standing there when she heard him come back. He came into the kitchen and saw her standing at the shelf with the pan in both hands and stopped. He read something in the picture she made. She didn't know exactly what, and he stayed at the door. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. She put the pan back on the shelf. "Walter says the south fence is holding." "It is." He didn't move from the door. "Eliza." She turned around. "I owe you something I haven't said yet," he said. She waited. "I owe you an honest account of what I thought when you stepped off that coach," he said. "And I think you deserve to hear it said plainly rather than have us both pretend it didn't happen." She held his gaze. "All right. I thought you were ordinary," he said. "I thought I'd made a practical decision, and the outcome was going to be practical and nothing more. I thought." He stopped, and the pause wasn't the controlled kind. It was the kind that meant he was choosing words carefully because the words actually mattered. "I thought capability and worth were things I measured in a specific way. Specific to what I thought I needed. And now," she said. "Now I think I had a very narrow idea of what worth looked like," he said. "And I think I built a very large ranch on a very narrow idea. And I would have lost it, not to Calvert, not to Donnelly, but to the slow weight of running something that had no one in it who was looking at the whole thing." He looked at her steadily. "You were looking at the whole thing from the first hour." She was quiet. "I'm not good at this," he said, "at saying the thing directly." "You're doing fine," she said. "I don't want this to be an arrangement," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I know what I said in the letters. I know what we agreed. And I know you came here with clear eyes and practical expectations, and I don't have the right to change the terms of something you agreed to in good faith." She looked at him for a long moment. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes, I've been here 3 weeks," she said. "I've worked alongside you, and I've watched you, and I've sat across from you in this kitchen at 2 a.m, and I've seen the parts of you that you don't show people on purpose." She paused. "I'm not a woman who confuses gratitude with feeling. I know the difference." He was very still. "I'm also not a woman who pretends she doesn't know what she knows," she said. "And I know that whatever this is, it isn't only an arrangement. Not anymore." Possibly not from the moment you almost laughed at something I said in the first week and then stopped yourself like you'd forgotten you were allowed to. Something moved across his face, past the control, past the managed surface, real and unguarded and completely his. I didn't forget, he said quietly. I just didn't know what to do with it. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. You just have to stop managing it away. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she didn't move back. And when he took her hands in both of his, not dramatically, not with any performance of the gesture, just the simple claiming of something that had been there and unacknowledged, she understood that whatever he'd been building for 3 weeks had just stopped pretending to be something smaller than it was. I'm not an easy man, he said. I know, she said. I'm not an easy woman. No, he said. You are absolutely not. And this time the almost law made it all the way. Real and warm and entirely his on the 5th day. Prescott's word came. It came in a formal letter delivered by a courthouse courier from Helena, which told her something about the seriousness of what was inside before she opened it. Nathaniel opened it himself, standing in the kitchen with her beside him. Prescott had filed the counter-evidence 3 days ago. The territorial court had reviewed the survey reconstruction and the original field notes and the documentation of systematic boundary marker movement. It had reviewed Eliza's supply records and their corroborating relationship to the overall operations timeline. And it had received separately a sworn statement from Gerald Donnelly, the information he'd traded for the standing of his repayment agreement, which detailed 3 previous Calvert operations in the territory and named the member of the land commission who had facilitated 2 of the approval hearings. The territorial court had suspended Calvert's filing pending a full investigation. The boundary claim against Brooks Ranch's southern 40 acres was on hold. And, given the evidence now in the record, Prescott's read was that it would not survive the investigation. Reuben Calvert had been asked to appear before the commission. The commission member, whose name Donnelly had provided, had resigned. Nathaniel read the letter twice. She read it once and then looked at him. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before, not the controlled surface, not the almost law, not the unguarded moment in the kitchen the previous evening. Something quieter than all of those. A man who had been braced against something for so long that the removal of the weight felt unfamiliar, and he needed a moment to understand that the floor was still there. It's not finished, he said. The investigation still had to run. The repayment agreement with Donnelly was still in motion. The feed orders needed restructuring with a new supplier. No, she said, but the worst of it is, he put the letter down on the table between them. He looked at it, and then at her. The kitchen records, he said. Prescott said they were central. He mentioned that in the letter. A supply ledger, Nathaniel said. Kept by a woman who'd been in this kitchen 10 days. That's what broke a year-long operation. The kitchen always tells the truth, she said. You just have to know how to read it. He looked at her with that expression, the real one. The full one that he'd stopped managing away. I knew nothing about you, he said. When you stepped off that coach, I knew what was in the letter and nothing else. That's all I knew about you, she said. You weren't what I expected. I know you were, he paused. Not searching for a word, deciding whether to say the one he already had. You were more than I knew how to see at first. She held his gaze. And now? Now I see clearly, he said, which is a different experience from what I thought seeing clearly felt like. She understood that. She understood it in the way you understand things that have happened to you, rather than things you've been told. Walter came in 20 minutes later, saw their faces, read the room in his direct and efficient way, and picked up the letter from the table without being invited. He read it through. He set it back down. Calvert's finished in this territory, he said. Likely, Nathaniel said. And Donnelly? 2 years of repayment, Nathaniel said. Full amount. He honored his side. Walter nodded slowly. He looked at Eliza. He said nothing, But the look said everything that 15 years of loyalty and careful observation could put into a single direct gaze. And she received it with the same directness. "I'll tell the men," Walter said. And he left. They could hear him in the yard a few minutes later, and they could hear the sound the men made when they received good news. Not shouting, not whooping, but the particular sound of relief made audible by a group of people who have been carrying something they didn't entirely know the weight of until it was lifted. Pete's voice rose briefly above the rest, characteristically unbounded. And someone laughed, and then several more did, and the yard sounded for the first time like what it was, a working ranch full of people who had decided to stay. That evening, she cooked the best meal she'd made at Brooks Ranch. Not to celebrate in any showy sense. Not because the occasion demanded performance. But because the kitchen was her domain, and the people in it were her people now. And feeding them well was the most honest expression she knew of what she felt. She made slow-roasted beef the way her mother had taught her, with the herbs she'd been cultivating carefully since the second week, and the root vegetables that were finally, properly, stored in conditions where they kept their quality. She made real bread, the risen kind, not the quick kind, and a dried apple cake with the stores she'd been saving. When the men came to the table, the room did what rooms do when a meal is made with complete attention. It got quiet first, and then loud in the right way, and the loudness was the kind that filled a place up, rather than overloading it. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table. She sat beside him, which was where she had not quite sat before, always slightly apart. Always in the position of the person managing the meal rather than sharing it. Tonight she sat beside him and ate with the rest of them. And nobody commented on the shift because everyone felt it was simply correct. After supper, when the men had filtered back to the bunkhouse, and Walter had gone with them, and the kitchen was quiet again, Nathaniel helped her clear the table. He did it without announcement, without asking if it was needed, without the slight stiffness of a man performing a gesture. He simply picked up the plates the way someone does when a space belongs to them as much as it belongs to anyone else. She washed and he dried, which was an entirely ordinary thing, and felt like no ordinary thing at all. "My father would have liked you," he said, drying a plate with the careful attention he brought to everything. "What makes you say that?" He respected people who were direct, he said, and people who worked without needing to be watched. He set the plate down. And people who kept good records, she laughed. It surprised her, the fullness of it. How unguarded it came out. She hadn't laughed like that in a long time, and she hadn't noticed the absence until this moment, when the presence of it was suddenly very clear. He was watching her when she looked up, with the full expression. "The real one. There it is," he said quietly. She understood what he meant. She didn't explain it, and neither did he. She handed him the next dish to dry. They finished the kitchen in a comfortable quiet that had nothing empty in it. And when the last lamp was turned low and the ranch was fully settled into its nighttime sounds, the wind, the distant cattle, the creak of a building that had been standing long enough to have opinions about the weather, she stood at the kitchen door for a moment and looked at the room. The cast iron pan was on its shelf. The records were in their proper order. The pantry was organized and stocked and tracked. The work table was clean. The stove was banked for morning. 3 weeks ago, this kitchen had been a place of exhaustion and neglect. And the ranch around it had been quietly hemorrhaging everything that made it worth keeping. A scheme had been running in the dark for almost a year, feeding on the assumption that nobody was paying attention. Someone had been paying attention. Someone had walked in with a plain dress and 2 suitcases and a cast iron pan and had started reading the truth from the first morning. And the truth, stubborn, surviving, patient in the cracks, had done what her mother always said it would do. It had held. Brooks Ranch stood whole and solvent and fully itself on that Montana evening. And the woman who had come to it as an arrangement had become the thing that arrangements, at their very best, can occasionally and unexpectedly become the solid center of something that intended to last.